Every story on Datago 100 is like a conversation over a hot cup of coffee. Welcome. I present to you today a delightful new mystery, starring Agatha Christie's adored amateur detective, Miss Marple, who is always perceptive and incredibly sharp. Make yourself at home, and together, let's solve this endearing riddle. Additionally, if you would like, please tell me where you're joining from in a brief comment. Finding out from where our small detective community is listening is always a pleasure. Now let's begin. Greystone Hall and Miss Marple and the Curse of the Sapphire Ring. Miss Marple's carriage rattled down the long country lane on a crisp afternoon. Still damp from the rain of the previous night, the sky, a pale English gray, hung low over fields. Miss Marple, wearing her sensible wool coat, sat comfortably with her hands folded, her thoughts straying between the letter in her handbag and the gentle hum of the wheels. Lady Camilla Greville, a distant acquaintance with whom Miss Marple had rarely communicated more than Christmas cards over the years, had sent the invitation. The actual letter was quite intriguing. It was formal but also urgent, and beneath the politeness there was a clear sense of unease. Miss Marple was intrigued enough to agree to the sapphire ring, which was the subject of the discussion. Naturally, the village was buzzing with conversation. After a catastrophe some 40 years ago, the sapphire was long believed to be lost, but it had unexpectedly reappeared. Its return was accompanied by the old rumors that anyone who dared to possess it would suffer terrible misfortune. Having witnessed enough life, Miss Marple knew that curses were typically the result of human hands and hearts rather than supernatural forces. A grand, proud building whose stone facade had weathered and lost its luster, Greystone Hall loomed larger than Miss Marple remembered. Ivy held on to the eastern wing too tightly, and the windows, clean as they were, seemed to reflect more shadow than light. When her carriage came to a stop, the door opened with a spooky speed, as if someone had been waiting for her. An older man with a duty-worn face, the butler, greeted her with courteous indifference. But Miss Marple could see a pause in his eyes, a brief flash of something he knew but chose not to express. Instead of being welcomed with warmth, Miss Marple entered a house that was too quiet, as if the house itself was waiting and listening. The scent of old roses and beeswax mingled with the sharper, unmistakable edge of fear in the air. It was not the first time she had seen it. A hostess with a secret, smiling too brightly to conceal the tremor in her hands, was a common expression worn by houses with too many untold stories. It was the same at Greystone Hall. Miss Marple was presented to the weekend visitors in the drawing room. They were a group of people whose smiles could have been painted on them due to their meticulous politeness. A shade too loud was the booming laugh of Colonel Braithwaite, whose mustache was bristling with importance. His wife, Eleanor, was beside him, smiling thinly, her hands never leaving her brandy glass. On the other side of the room sat young Lydia Greville, Camilla's niece, whose beauty was only faintly tempered by the shawl of perpetual worry that hung over her shoulders. Not to mention the sapphire ring, which is the focal point of the mantelpiece and is housed in a tiny glass display. Its blue surface glinted in the firelight, almost purposefully, as if it were a thing that knew all about its own mythology. The guests' eyes flitted toward it frequently, Miss Marple observed, some with open curiosity and others with the sly look of people who recall too much. Despite the pleasant dullness of the conversations, there was something brittle beneath each word, as if the wrong question could instantly break the delicate harmony. As Miss Marple took her tea, she looked around the room absently, recording every look and every avoidance in her silent mental journal. The sapphire's curse was mentioned by Lady Camilla herself, but with the slightest hint of someone hoping to be refuted. Although it was obvious that the others knew the story by heart, she told it for Miss Marple's benefit. Legend has it that Lady Violet Greville was the first to own the ring, and she wore it the night her fiancé vanished without a trace. Her brother passed away inexplicably years later, with the ring discovered clutched in his hand. Ever since, each wearer has experienced tragedy, scandal, or unexpected death. As his wife poured herself another glass, her hand trembled slightly, but Colonel Braithwaite laughed it off, saying that curses were the domain of old women and idle minds. The house seemed to exhale in the brief silence that followed Lydia's rather hurried excuse, as she had been silent up until this point. Miss Marple was well aware that gossip and curses only flourish in environments where there are gaps in the truth, and there were plenty of gaps in Greystone Hall. Miss Marple, her knitting resting lightly in her lap, remained quietly pleasant throughout. She gathered answers even though she didn't pose any direct questions. When the history of the ring was mentioned, a hand twitched, a glance was shared, and then abruptly ended, and when Lady Violet's name was said, there was an unusually sharp silence. People rarely needed to be questioned to reveal themselves, as Miss Marple had discovered long ago. Through their pauses and the things they chose not to say, they revealed their fears. By the end of tea, Miss Marple was quietly certain of two things. Everyone in the room had a reason, no matter how minor, to wish the sapphire ring had remained lost forever, and nobody genuinely thought the curse was absurd. The forced cheer that permeates country house gatherings, where unsaid tensions linger just below the surface, permeated the dinner service. Every word felt carefully chosen, every smile a bit too tight, and the silverware clinked politely, but the conversation flowed with a purposeful ease. Finally, Colonel Braithwaite mentioned the sapphire ring, his voice booming louder than needed. He pointed to the mantelpiece with the ring under its glass dome, glistening blue in the candlelight, and said, "There's our guest of honor." Naturally, it also carries the well-known curse. Miss Marple has probably heard about it all. After pausing for a moment, Lady Camilla, who was seated at the head of the table, smiled thinly. No one had asked her, but she said, "We don't pay much attention to silly stories." Nevertheless, the question had been posed, and in a place like Greystone Hall, stories rarely decide to go away quietly once they are invited in. As a result, the story continued to be told, just as it had been for many generations. Lady Violet Greville was the original owner of the sapphire, and she wore it with pride on the evening of her engagement. However, her fiancé disappeared without a trace before the evening was over. The sapphire was discovered on her dressing table a few days later, together with a letter that was so shattered and upset that it was rumored Lady Violet went insane after reading it. After several years, the sapphire ended up in the possession of Violet's brother, a man with extravagant spending patterns and unpredictable wealth. When guests arrived one winter evening, they discovered him dead at his desk with the sapphire clenched in his fist. No cause of death could be identified, and there were no indications of violence. There was a spooky silence throughout the house as the lone candle burned out in the room's corner. The sapphire's reputation was set in stone from that point on. It was said to bring ruin, shame, or worse to those who wore it or even dared handle it. Following its appearance, fortunes fell, engagements ended, and accidents claimed lives. Lady Camilla's fingers worried the edge of her napkin as she spoke, her voice faltering slightly. "Of course," she said, trying to be bright. "Don't these old tales have a way of becoming their own thing?" However, nobody chuckled, and the sapphire appeared colder in some way when it re-emerged in the light. The room was filled with Colonel Braithwaite's laughter, which was half too loud. With needless bluster, he pounded his fist against the table and declared, "A load of rot. Curses are reserved for superstitious people. Our current situation is purely coincidental." Eleanor, his wife, remained silent and gripped her wineglass tightly until her knuckles turned white. Lydia Greville, a young girl, tried to smile, but her eyes would not meet anyone else's. A practical-minded solicitor, Mr. Frobisher, threw off the curse with a flick of his hand, but even he gave the sapphire a single look as if he couldn't bear to ignore it completely. The guests who were most silent were the ones who revealed the most. The quiet at the table was a reflection of personal anxieties that were too near the surface, not a belief in antiquated magic. Miss Marple remained silent, her hands folded neatly next to her plate. While others debated superstition and legends, she had witnessed guilt conceal itself behind practicality and fear dress itself in mockery for her entire life. Miss Marple did her best, as always. She observed. As she reached for her water glass, she noticed the tremor in Lady Camilla's hand, which had not been present when the soup was served. Every time the curse was mentioned, she could see Lydia's eyes flicker to the sapphire before she caught herself and snapped back to her plate. And there was Eleanor Braithwaite, smiling despite having her shoulders drawn so tightly they might break. However, Mr. Frobisher captured her interest the longest. For a man who took pride in looking at the evidence first, His dismissal had happened far too soon. His hands stayed in his lap, as if touching the table itself would bring him too near the orbit of the ring, and his laugh had lagged behind the Colonel's by half a second. Miss Marple was aware that people hardly ever expressed their fears openly. The truth was always revealed by the little betrayals, the anxious look, the overly eager denial, and the too perfect calm. Even after dinner was over, the story persisted. Though the tone of the conversations lightened, the Sapphire sat silently between them all, its legend hovering over the table like a fog over the moor beneath every word. Miss Marple had additional knowledge. Once uttered out loud, a curse is difficult to ignore. In this house, whatever had started long ago had not yet finished, and as the visitors withdrew to their rooms, some of them walked quickly, while others were cautious at every step. Miss Marple was left with just one idea. Not all ghosts haunt hallways. In the hearts of the living, they live in silence. In the muted silence that follows a night of restless sleep, morning descended upon Greystone Hall. With doors creaking open, footsteps padding down hallways, and the faint clink of teacups in the breakfast room, the house began to slowly stir. Lydia Greville was the first to scream. Her voice pierced the atmosphere with a brittle, sharp voice, and soon the whole household was gathered at the door of Mr. Frobisher's bedroom. The inside of the lock was bolted. Upon forcing the door open, Mr. Frobisher was found dead on the bed, his eyes wide with astonished surprise and his face pale. And the sapphire ring glinted coldly in the morning light on his finger. The guest stood motionless, gazing at the ring as if it were about to come to life once more, its curse being fulfilled. Miss Marple was the only one whose eyes strayed to the victim's hand, which was resting just so on the coverlet, fingers curled ever so slightly, as if placing something. A flurry of speculation and terror swept through the house. The curse was first invoked by Mrs. Braithwaite, whose voice trembled with the assurance of someone who had always thought that evil was best communicated by passing objects from hand to hand. She whispered, "I told you that the sapphire would never return in a positive way." Her husband's voice was not as forceful as usual, but he still gave a loud denial. He said it was nonsensical, but as he reached for his pipe, his hand trembled a little. Lady Camilla made an effort to use reason and advocate for composure, but the rising panic overshadowed her words. Old tales, each more sinister than the last, were pulled from the depths of memory. Every memory was heightened by fear. The broken engagement, the missing fiancé, the brother's mysterious death, until the legend itself appeared to breathe inside the walls. Miss Marple said nothing all the time. She had witnessed numerous homes engulfed in terror, and she was aware that truth frequently lurked beneath the chaos during such times. As the others discussed spirits and curses, Miss Marple's thoughts stayed firmly grounded in the human condition. She saw Lydia's hands shaking, gripping the chair's edge as if the wood's rigidity would be enough to keep her steady. Mrs. Braithwaite, who typically enjoyed demanding attention, refused to look at anyone at this time, instead focusing her attention on an unseen object outside the window. Always the voice of authority, Colonel Braithwaite spoke too loudly and too insistently, as if he thought that volume alone would dispel any doubt. Miss Marple was well aware that guilt is not always manifested through criminal activity. It can occasionally cling to a person's edges, a shadow cast by something they are afraid to speak out loud. She was drawn to a casual comment made by the family solicitor, Mr. Henshaw. "Isn't it a terrible business? Especially after what he knew," he said. "What was it he knew?" Miss Marple inquired, her eyes keen but her voice soft. Mr. Henshaw went pale. "Oh, of course, nothing specific. Simply family issues. That was all. A brief remark, a moment's error." However, to Miss Marple, it was the first sign of something bigger beneath the surface and a crack in the veneer. Tensions grew as the guests started the uncomfortable task of reenacting the evening. Each described their movements, providing alibis that were either overly certain or otherwise rife with holes that were conveniently left unanswered. Mrs. Braithwaite asserted that she had gone to bed early, but her maid subtly refuted this, mentioning that a light was still burning long after midnight. Lydia acknowledged that she couldn't sleep and would walk down the hallway, but she maintained that she never went past Mr. Frobisher's door. Although he had assumed it was the house settling, Colonel Braithwaite, who took pride in his sound sleep, admitted to hearing a creak on the stair. Nobody reported hearing a struggle, a cry, or an inappropriate sound. As she listened, Miss Marple knitted slowly, incorporating every contradiction into her understanding. The odd way each guest discussed the victim, though, with a cautious neutrality as if each had a minor grievance they would rather keep to themselves, caught her attention the most. The locked door was both a fact and a symbol, a riddle that needed to be solved. Who could have gone in or out without anyone noticing if the door had been bolted from the inside? And why? As if he were afraid of what might happen. Would a man who had so eagerly worn the sapphire ring suddenly lock himself away? Colonel Braithwaite referred to it as suicide, but his tone was unconvinced. The paranormal was Mrs. Braithwaite's preference. Mr. Henshaw muttered something about a man's guilt eventually catching up with him. But Miss Marple was wise enough not to believe appearances. Fear had a way of making men bolt doors against the wrong danger, and locked rooms were rarely as impossible as they appeared. The true danger had come from within, not from the outside. What frightened Mr. Frobisher enough to lock the door in the first place was now the question, not how it was locked. In the midst of the commotion and conjecture, Miss Marple's eyes refocused on the body, on the hand on top of the coverlet. The fingers were curled in a purposeful motion, as if they were reaching for something, rather than in the natural stillness of death. A torn corner of paper, its edges creased with haste, lay just beneath them, nearly out of sight. Nobody else took notice. A delicate chain of connections started to form inside Miss Marple's mind as she allowed the conversation to swirl around her. The paper, the curse, the locked door, Lydia's uncontrollable look, and the comment Mr. Henshaw attempted to suppress. Mr. Frobisher had died of fear, but it was not the sapphire that had caused it. It had originated from someone or something much closer. Each guest at Greystone Hall wore the thin armor of polite conversation during breakfast, which was a performance of forced civility that did not conceal the tremor of nerves beneath. Lydia Greville pushed her food around without really intending to eat it, her gaze never leaving her plate. While Colonel Braithwaite filled the silence with a series of irrelevant anecdotes, his voice a bit too hearty, Lady Camilla poured tea with a hand that trembled a little. Normally abrasive and quick to correct her husband, Mrs. Braithwaite sat in unusual silence, her eyes repeatedly straying to the now vacant seat where Mr. Frobisher had sat the previous evening. Miss Marple, who was sitting quietly by the window, did not comment. She had long since discovered that when people are afraid, they talk to reassure themselves rather than to educate others, and in their haste to seem calm, they end up disclosing much more than they meant to. A too fast denial there, a missed beat here. Little things. But little things meant a lot to Miss Marple. Perhaps too eager to prove his innocence before anyone dared to doubt it, Colonel Braithwaite was the first to volunteer his version of events. He butter-baked his toast with needless force and said, "We all retired at a reasonable hour. Additionally, I slept like a log and didn't hear anything during the night." His wife, with sad eyes, didn't add anything to support or refute it. Lydia muttered that she had had trouble falling asleep and had instead spent some time walking down the hallway, although she maintained that her steps never brought her close to Mr. Frobisher's door. With a gentle nod, Miss Marple asked questions that were so gentle and unthreatening that nobody took them seriously until the responses fell apart. Lydia had been out for a walk, but at what time, before or after Lady Camilla's light had gone out? Did anyone hear the opening or closing of a door? Really, it was amazing how easily memories clashed when even the smallest pressure was applied. Mrs. Braithwaite vividly remembered seeing a chink of light under the door long after midnight, but Lady Camilla insisted that her light had been extinguished at exactly 11. Miss Marple just listened, letting the truth unravel one thread at a time without leveling any charges. The next thing that caught Miss Marple's attention was a quick but distinct look. Lydia's eyes strayed to Lady Camilla as she reached for the butter dish, a fleeting and pointless glance. However, Lady Camilla turned around, and both women froze for a split second. That look contained history, mutual understanding, and the kind of unspoken understanding that unites two people, either through secrets or guilt, that are too risky to discuss out loud. It appeared that no one else noticed. Mrs. Braithwaite had withdrawn into her own troubled silence, and Colonel Braithwaite was too busy pontificating. However, Miss Marple had lived her entire life watching villages from the garden gates, where silence between people frequently revealed secrets rather than words. Whatever had transpired between Lady Camilla and Lydia was nothing new, but it had recently acquired a new significance, the sort of significance that arises when a shared past meets new guilt. Later that morning, voices came from a partially open door as Miss Marple walked quietly and slowly down the hallway. Although she didn't intend to listen, tension tends to attract the human ear as strongly as a needle does to a pole. But why didn't he speak up if he knew? A woman spoke in a low, urgent whisper. If Miss Marple was not misinformed, a man's voice answered, "Mr. Henshaw." The answer came because he knew too much, and if it all came out, it was because of what had previously occurred. Abrupt silence, a door shut. The room was deserted by the time Miss Marple left. Her face remained the same, but she was thinking about it. Silently, the pieces were shifting positions. Mr. Frobisher had been killed for what he already knew, which was rooted in the long shadow of the past rather than the present, rather than for what he might do. By the afternoon, Miss Marple was sitting by herself in the tiny library, knitting in her lap. The Sapphire, with its alleged curse now reduced to mere ornamentation, had long since left her thoughts. Her thoughts instead followed a much more human thread, one that was woven from long-suppressed anxieties, hidden relationships, and the kind of guilt that lurks in the background for decades until someone or something compels it to come to the surface. She still didn't know how they had done it behind a locked door or who had killed Mr. Frobisher. But she knew one thing for sure. The past had never been the past. Under Greystone Hall's roof, it was alive and breathing, patiently waiting for the perfect opportunity to reach out, either with a trembling hand or maybe with a lethal push. And Miss Marple was certain that the past would make its claim before the weekend was over. For once, the house was preoccupied. Lady Camilla busied herself comforting Lydia in a quiet manner. The constable and Colonel Braithwaite argued about the ridiculousness of curses. Mrs. Braithwaite had completely withdrawn to her room, pale and silent. Unnoticed as ever, Miss Marple used the occasion to slip silently upstairs. The attic, where time and memory were left to collect dust, was frequently more revealing than any locked diary or whispered confession, according to her long-held belief that houses themselves were repositories of truth. Greystone Hall was one such home. She ascended the slender staircase with deliberate steps, her fingers lightly tracing the wall. When she touched the wood, it felt cold. However, there was another factor. There was a subtle feeling, almost like a memory in and of itself, that the house was preparing for whatever she might discover. The attic possessed the unique silence of long-forgotten rooms. Only the weight of years weighed on the air, not any warmth. Miss Marple moved slowly, her senses tuned to what others might miss, her eyes adjusting to the low light. Their contents revealed secrets that no one had cared to recover, and there were trunks stacked carelessly, some open, some tightly sealed with rusted clasps. In the midst of the mess, Miss Marple's hand stopped on a little wooden box that was plain in shape but had a thin layer of dust on it from recent disturbances. There was a bundle of letters tied with faded silk ribbon inside, wrapped with the shaky care of one who both loved and feared its contents. Unread for decades, but pulsing with the uneasy burden of unresolved matters. As if the past had been waiting to speak all this time, Miss Marple's fingers touched the first page, the words sharp, but the ink faded. The letters described a covert engagement that the family had discreetly buried long before any of the participants were even born. A man beneath her station, a young artist with little money and promise but a heart full of devotion, had been promised to Lady Violet Greville. Violet's own mother had given her the sapphire ring as a memento of the engagement. It was supposed to represent happiness in the future, but the engagement had fallen apart in a matter of weeks. A sudden disappearance, a betrayal whispered in the hallways, and the sapphire, once a symbol of love, turned into a source of shame. A string of half-truths and purposeful silences ensued. Under circumstances too delicate to describe, Lady Violet's fiancé disappeared, and Violet herself was sent overseas, her shame transformed into a story of sickness and recovery. In order to hide a scandal, the sapphire became a ghost story and made a safe return to the family. The curse story was a convenient fiction created out of necessity to make sure no one paid too much attention to what had actually occurred. And like all good stories, it was told so much that the family eventually started to believe it. Miss Marple's face was calm, but her mind narrowed to one thing as she folded the letters back into their silk cocoon. The Sapphire had never been the victim of the curse, that easy scapegoat for tragedy. It was inherited from the family itself. It was a curse of guilt, silence, and the weight of lives torn apart by secrets no one dared to reveal, not magic. The deliberate turning of scandal into folklore, a tale intended to deceive both strangers and descendants, was what most shocked Miss Marple, not the betrayal per se. That was commonplace enough. The truth that no one wants to speak out loud is a true curse. Miss Marple had a quiet confidence that someone downstairs, who was at this very meeting, not only knew the truth, but also had a motive to keep it hidden. She believed that the past was a very forgiving entity. It always waited for someone stupid enough to wake it up. The letters made a safe return to their hiding place as Miss Marple went down the attic stairs. She was aware that the tragedy of the weekend had not started with the return of the Sapphire or with the death of Mr. Frobisher. It had started long ago in the silent hallways of family disgrace, where secrets were allowed to fester and the truth was too expensive to speak. And Miss Marple realized that the past was no longer happy to remain hidden as footsteps resounded below and whispered voices filled the hall. Through a murdered man and a sapphire ring, it had extended its hand to demand its rightful place. The day started with hurried footsteps and raised voices as words swept through the house, rather than soft conversation or the soft clinking of teacups. There was no sapphire. The glass case on the mantelpiece was empty, its lock was forced, and the velvet underneath it, where the ring had been, was slightly agitated. Lady Camilla was pale, her fingers fluttering at her collar in futility. With her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles gleamed white, Lydia stood next to her, pale and silent. Mrs. Braithwaite sat silent and with a stiff back, as if she had anticipated this all along, while Colonel Braithwaite demanded answers in his customary belligerent manner. Arriving silently, Miss Marple gazed calmly at the scene. She had witnessed fear pass for indignation before, and this time would not be the last. It wasn't just theft when a jewel went missing in a home where murder had already been committed. Its disappearance was no accident, whether it was taken for concealment or protection. And Miss Marple was aware that the sapphire would reveal much more than the thief had planned before the day was over. The family split up almost instantly. Those who blamed the curse were on one side, whispering about forces that should be left alone, about ancient wrongs, and about objects that were deadly just by touching them. The pragmatic, on the other hand, insisted that it was just typical theft, someone taking advantage of the confusion. It might even be the same hand that had killed Mr. Frobisher. However, Miss Marple wasn't particularly interested in the arguments themselves. The faces behind them were the cause. Those who demanded cold logic were the ones who most needed the appearance of control, while those who had something very real to fear were frequently the loudest advocates of superstition. Every theory put forth was more of a confession of private beliefs, personal anxieties, and the guilt no one wanted to identify than it was an explanation. Miss Marple silently gathered every avoided glance, every overly slick alibi, and every glimmer of relief when attention turned elsewhere while listening without contributing anything herself. After all, she had always been more interested in human nature than in curses. Miss Marple went back to the silent task of reconstruction, using memory rather than a notebook or magnifying glass, while others argued and conjectured. She remembered what each visitor had done the previous evening, who had provided an alibi before anyone had asked, who had lingered when they had no reason to, and who had abruptly excused themselves. Lady Camilla was the first to retire, her nerves exhausted. Lydia had trailed behind, her eyes darting back toward the sapphire one final time, her steps unsure. Speaking too loudly about duty and family honor, Colonel Braithwaite had stayed by the fire. Between the last glass of port and the first scream of the morning, someone had sneaked back into the drawing room, pushed open the case, and removed the ring. His wife had been noticeably absent, only coming back when her absence could no longer be ignored. The how was sufficiently obvious. Miss Marple suspected that greed had little to do with the reason. Fear was at the heart of it. Colonel Braithwaite could scarcely have known that he was the one who set off Miss Marple's memory. "This house has damned, creaky floors," he muttered during breakfast. Half the night, I could hear someone pacing. A straightforward comment that could be easily disregarded, but to Miss Marple, it seemed to fit too neatly. She recalled Lydia's shaky gait and the way her feet faltered close to the attic stairs. She also recalled how, despite the fact that the evening had been completely dry, Mrs. Braithwaite had returned to the drawing room with her shoes leaving faint traces of damp on the hearth rug. One groaning floorboard, one errant step, one instant torn between guilt and hesitation. It was not yet proof. However, Miss Marple was well aware that the most crucial hints are frequently those that no one is able to provide. Yes, the sapphire had disappeared, but the ring itself was not the true story. It concerned the last person to touch it and the secret they intended to bury with it. After breakfast, Miss Marple graciously declined Lydia's invitation to join her outside after carefully tying her scarf. She used fresh air as an excuse, but her goal was more calculated. Miss Marple knew the local gossip network was the best source of truth in any village. A web world between the churchyard bench, the post office hatch, and the grocer's counter, where secrets were rarely kept hidden for long and whispers traveled more quickly than smoke. Her eyes were sharp under their kindly blue, but she walked slowly down the lane, stopping occasionally to admire a particularly vigorous rosebush or an untidy hedge. Miss Marple had long since mastered the art of appearing innocuous. People would say things to an elderly woman who seemed uninterested that they would never consider telling a police officer, which was an oddity. Miss Marple stayed long enough for her presence to seem incidental at the village shop, where scandal and flour were measured in equal measure. A jar of barley sugar turned into the ideal pretext for listening. Whoa, is it back? With the solemnity of a coroner, Mrs. Coombs weighed out tea leaves. That sapphire has always been cursed. Elsie, did I not tell you about Violet Greville's fate? Miss Marple's brows raised a tiny bit. No guest had spoken Lady Violet's name so familiarly, but it had floated through the house like smoke. Like water from a long, dry tap, the story flowed. A broken engagement, a missing heirloom, a feud from years ago, and rumors of a letter destroyed out of rage had all occurred. With charges too heinous to utter out loud, but too delicious to forget, Greystone Hall and the village had split into silent factions. None of this had been discussed in the house itself, but here it was, splattered across soap flakes and barley sugar, patiently awaiting a listener. The story became more complex and intricate as Miss Marple went from shop to post office, each retelling adding a layer of varnish to the ancient wood. Although Violet Greville's covert engagement to a man no family would approve of had ended in tragedy, it wasn't just her fault. A second family lived quietly just outside the village boundary, their fortunes fluctuating with each new chapter of the story, and there were unpaid debts and money that changed hands in the dark. By connecting names mentioned during breakfast with names that were only vaguely remembered by the villagers, Miss Marple connected the stories. The sapphire ring was always at the center, not only as a cursed item, but also as a symbol of guilt that was exchanged silently and understandingly. It was more than just a family heirloom or a jewel. While the drawing room remained perfectly polite, it served as a symbol of who had won, who had lost, and who had been left to suffer in silence. With the reckless confidence of someone who believes everyone knows the same story, the postmistress unintentionally revealed the finished product. "Of course," she said. "Has he not returned before?" Now, no one would address him by his true name. You have to wonder if Lady Camilla was aware of it all along. Miss Marple's mind sharpened like a needle finding its eye, but her smile never wavered. One of the guests had lied about who they had ever been, not about where they had been the night before. A new moniker and a dignified past that has been meticulously developed over time. However, beneath the surface, the truth was interwoven with the darkest secrets of the house. This visitor had been involved in the long-running conflict, which was linked to both Violet's tragedy and the incidents that had tarnished the sapphire with a substance far more harmful than superstition. They had returned to Greystone Hall as someone with unresolved business and possibly a murderous motive, not as an innocent bystander. Miss Marple's mind was as neat as her knitting bag when she got back home. Every rumor was meticulously arranged in its correct location. The sapphire's theft, Mr. Frobisher's murder, and the tension that had permeated the house from the moment she arrived. They were not distinct threads. Rather, they were woven together by betrayal, greed, and the resentment of a scandal that was never entirely put to rest. She was now aware that fear of a curse was not the killer's motivation. It was apprehension that the truth would eventually surface. Miss Marple was certain of one more thing as the hall door shut behind her. Quietly whispering about the past in the village shop was no longer enough. It had knocked on Greystone Hall's door and would not go until its tale was told. The household had identified its villain by the middle of the afternoon. Selecting an outsider, someone who did not fully fit into Greystone Hall's fragile social structure, was always practical. The obvious suspect turned out to be the solicitor, Mr. Henshaw. To minds already conditioned by fear and the need for a scapegoat, his tenuous connection to the Sapphire's reappearance was sufficient. Rumors circulated about his financial difficulties, a nasty family conflict from his past, and a particularly nasty business with a disputed will. All of it is helpful in portraying him as the kind of man who could silence a man who knew too much or help himself to a valuable ring, but none of it is relevant. With impeccable poise, Miss Marple knitted as she listened. It was an interesting thing, she thought. How frequently an innocent conscience is slower to assign guilt than a guilty one. But Miss Marple knew better than to follow the house's decision. It is rare for true guilt to show itself so easily. Quiet, wary, and cautious, it lurks. And if Mr. Henshaw lacked anything, it was caution. Sensing the shift in mood, Mr. Henshaw became noticeably defensive. Every attempt at communication turned into an act of innocence, with too much effort put into every word. When the topic of the missing Sapphire came up again at lunch, he talked endlessly without being asked about his honorable career, his meticulous honesty, and his great regard for the Grieville family. He provided answers to questions no one had asked and explanations no one needed. And the suspicion in the home grew stronger with every protest. Lady Camilla and Mrs. Braithwaite exchanged knowing looks. Lydia kept her eyes carefully lowered, too courteous to say anything. However, it was all too convenient for Miss Marple. Mr. Henshaw was undoubtedly a flawed man, but his guilt, if any, had a completely different flavor. His defensiveness spoke of the very human panic of a man who realizes too late that he has entered a world that is already full of blame, not murder. Miss Marple was aware that guilty men did not waste time arguing about their honesty. All they did was try to be forgotten. The actual moment arrived at tea, when guards are briefly let down and conversation settles into the cozy hum of insignificance. Colonel Braithwaite brought up the attic first, complaining of creaking beams and drafts. With her characteristic wit, Mrs. Braithwaite corrected him on a long-forgotten renovation detail. Then, very suddenly, Mr. Henshaw raised his voice. Buttering his scone, he remarked, "That attic is a terrible place." It's hardly surprising, though, given what transpired there all those years ago. A half-breath of silence fell over the room. No outsider should have been aware of the type of family embarrassment that occurred there all those years ago. Certainly not a visitor who, according to his own account, had never dealt with anything but land deeds and wills, and who was unaware of the earlier scandals at Greystone Hall. The tiny slip that caused Miss Marple's cup to pause just short of her lips appeared to her to be a crack in the veneer, an instance in which a lie became overconfident and thus betrayed its source. Everything changed with that one comment. Without any fanfare or announcement, Miss Marple started mentally piecing together the whole scene. The murder, the theft, and the Sapphire had all been meticulously covered by the handy shadow of a curse, and despite his defensive bumbling, Mr. Henshaw had never been the mastermind behind that scheme. Because of his prior irregularities, he was a red herring and the ideal target for suspicion. For a while, someone who had a much closer relationship with Greystone Hall had been successful in their prediction that the house would turn against him. However, guilt always leaves its mark on conversations rather than on things. It was the casual remark, the overly eager denial, the small detail that someone who shouldn't have known it at all remembered. As the teacups were cleared away and the conversation shifted to more secure subjects, Miss Marple's thoughts had already completely shifted away from Mr. Henshaw. Their secret, which had been concealed under layers of family embarrassment, was now reopened like an old wound, and the true culprit was still among them. Silently, Miss Marple delivered the summons with her customary grace, but with a firmness that no one dared to question. The household gathered in the drawing room one by one, some intrigued, some uneasy, all conscious that the time for reckoning had come. With her hands resting lightly on each other and her face as gentle and unthreatening as ever, Miss Marple stood in front of the mantelpiece. However, her silence carried a certain weight, as if the story no one wanted to hear was about to be told. Lydia clasped her hands in her lap. Lady Camilla sat on the edge of her chair, and Colonel Braithwaite cleared his throat. A man half decided whether to defend himself once more or to just walk away as Mr. Henshaw hovered near the door. Miss Marple gave a slight smile before starting to talk. Her words were as sharp as pins, but her voice was gentle. According to Miss Marple, the problem with curses is that they appeal most to people who have something they'd rather not talk about. She took a soft look around the room. The sapphire ring was never cursed, not in a supernatural sense, but it has been cursed time and time again by human jealousy, greed, and the innate desire to romanticize unpleasant realities. She looked at Lady Camilla for a moment. It is much easier to live with a ghost story than the possibility that a long-forgotten family scandal will still be remembered. She clarified that the sapphire had evolved into a handy scapegoat, a means of placing the blame on an item rather than the people who initially created the danger. She added that as soon as the sapphire arrived back at this house, it did what all cursed objects do. It turned into a mirror that reflected not ghosts from long ago, but rather the actual fear that each of you carried within you. Human nature's search for the simplest explanation was the cause of the subsequent theft, death, and growing suspicion rather than a supernatural curse. Miss Marple broke down the polite fictions of the evening, one by one. Lady Camilla had lied about her early retirement. When everyone else had gone to bed, she had gone back to the drawing room by herself. Why? To make sure the sapphire was secure because they were worried that if someone started asking the wrong questions, old ghosts could turn into new humiliations. Half of Lydia's midnight stroll had been real. Yes, she had walked, but not because she was anxious. Someone who needed to reassure her that keeping quiet was still best for her had summoned her with a note hidden beneath her door. Why was Mrs. Braithwaite not there? She had been in the attic to make sure nothing was discovered, not to look for answers. There are no old letters or lost records that could indicate a particular incident that occurred many years ago. Every alibi crumbled under its own weight. Every innocent denial crumbled into evasion, until what was left was a sequence of very human choices motivated by fear, greed, or regret rather than a magical curse. Miss Marple explained that since the theft was never supposed to be successful, it was the actual theft of the sapphire that ultimately led to the murderer's identification. In order to guarantee that, upon Mr. Frobisher's passing, everyone would turn to ghosts and legends rather than the person who stood to lose the most if long-kept secrets were revealed, it was theatrical and intended to strengthen belief in the curse. The sapphire clutched in the dead man's hand, the locked room. All of these elements were deliberately placed to make the death seem inexplicable. However, the clue, the only one that counted, was much more straightforward. According to Miss Marple, the victim was aware of the truth and had planned to tell others about it. He had every reason to be afraid of what a living person might do to stop him, but no reason to be afraid of curses. Neither money nor even the sapphire itself had motivated the murderer's actions. They had made sure that the very curse they hoped to take advantage of would end up being their own downfall by killing to preserve the lie that had kept Greystone Hall intact for decades. Even Miss Marple's voice grew softer. She claimed that the person who took the sapphire, set up the scene, and silenced Mr. Frobisher did so out of desperation rather than hatred. She turned in Mrs. Braithwaite's direction. Did you not know that your marriage, your place in this household, and your entire way of life would fall apart if the truth were revealed? Because Violet Greville's engagement was ruined in part by you, all those years ago. You made sure the sapphire's curse became your own by taking the letter that shouldn't have been seen. There was a slight but noticeable trembling in Mrs. Braithwaite's hands. The curse, you see, was never in the sapphire, Miss Marple concluded quietly. It was in the lies that were told to keep it safe, and in the anxiety that the truth would eventually be exposed. As they escorted Mrs. Braithwaite out of the room, she did not object. She kept her hands folded and her body straight, as if she thought that by remaining somewhat dignified, she might still be able to hold back the truth that had just been revealed to the world. Each of the other guests turned inward, weighing their own secrets against what had just been revealed, and they stood in silence, not out of sympathy, but out of uneasiness. Colonel Braithwaite gazed at the ground, His once dominant demeanor diminished to that of a man pondering in private how little he had really known his wife. Lydia's eyes stayed focused on the door while Lady Camilla's hands trembled slightly in her lap, but what she saw, or feared, remained her personal burden. Even Mr. Henshaw, who was no longer suspected, appeared lessened, as if the burden of what might have been still hung over him. Miss Marple remained silent. She had finished her work and presented the facts, but she was aware that justice was rarely as clear-cut as it appeared at the time. No amount of truth could unravel the web that had brought us to this point. One life was lost, another destroyed. Later, when she was by herself in the tiny sitting room, Miss Marple held a cup of tea, its warmth a silent solace from the cold that follows disclosures. Miss Marple stared at the sapphire ring with familiar understanding rather than fear as it glinted in the lamplight, and returned to its case. She reasoned that the curse had never resided within the stone. Her gem is merely a gem, immune to fate and incapable of evil. Human hearts, however, are a different story. The true curse was greed, resentment, guilt, and all those unhealed wounds that were passed down like heirlooms and festered beneath refined exteriors and courteous conversation. Simply put, the sapphire had served as a mirror, reflecting back the desires and anxieties that each individual carried with them. Greystone Hall was not haunted by ancient malice. It was the oldest of ghosts, human weakness, that crept through hallways and concealed itself in unsaid words until the burden of silence was too great for one heart to handle. And once more, Miss Marple reflected, tragedy had resulted from human nature rather than the paranormal. The house was now too quiet, as if Greystone Hall itself had let out a long-held breath, but the release had brought no serenity. The guests moved around more subtly, and their conversations lacked the typical affectations in favor of more respectful exchanges. Lady Camilla was left to sit alone in the parlor, her eyes distracted, her thoughts obviously circling some private regret, while Colonel Braithwaite vanished into his study, as if the walls, having heard too much, demanded a certain respect. Lydia stood by the window, the light streaming across her face in a way that simultaneously made her appear younger and older, a woman who had been set free from something she was not yet able to identify. Even the servants, going about their daily business with the air of someone cleaning around a grave, moved with a certain aplomb. While knitting in her corner, Miss Marple was aware that peace is not the same as calm. There are homes and families that never fully forget what they have witnessed, while other truths cling like smoke and others settle like dust. Miss Marple stopped by the drawing room just before she went to bed, her gaze returning to the sapphire. It was a jewel like any other, sitting quietly and motionless behind the recently fixed glass. But not quite. Gentle enough to be invisible to most, a draft stirred the air enough to make the lone candle on the mantel flicker. After gutting and stabilizing, the flame left a long, erratic shadow on the wall. Miss Marple's smile was small and personal, the smile of someone who understands that some stories are better left with a hint of doubt and that not all questions need answers. After all, human nature may account for the majority of things, but occasionally the world reminds us that reason is not always correct. As houses do, the house would move on. New secrets would seep into the floorboards, and fresh laughter would fill the rooms. However, Greystone Hall would recall the truth it exposed rather than the sapphire's curse. And maybe there was a true curse there after all, not in the house or the ring, but in the very human hearts that had initially made them both dangerous. One truth was more obvious than the others as Miss Marple sipped her tea quietly, and the house fell into a tense silence. The sapphire itself was never the true source of the curse. Neither the tragic tales passed down through whispered gossip nor the gleam of the gemstone concealed it. As usual, the curse resided in the hearts of people who held secrets they couldn't bear. Ghosts were not necessary for Greystone Hall's hallways to be haunted. The guilt was enough. The desperate need to erase the past, rewrite uncomfortable facts, and do whatever it takes to preserve one's reputation. The poison that permeated every part of the house was that. Ultimately, it wasn't an old ghost that claimed a life. It was just a natural human weakness. However, that raises a question. Do you think that even when people try to forget the truth, places remember it? There are always some secrets a house keeps to itself, even though Miss Marple may have solved this specific case. Will there ever be true peace in Greystone Hall, in your opinion? Or do you think that once a story is sparked, it can never be completely put out? I would love to know what you think. What do you believe to be the Sapphire ring's true curse? Was it the individuals carrying the jewel or the jewel itself? And what would you have done differently if you had been Miss Marple? Let's maintain the mystery. Leave your theories in the comments section. Make sure to subscribe for more stories with twists, secrets, and astute deductions if you liked this one and you enjoy classic mysteries. Additionally, show this video to anyone you know who appreciates a classic whodunit. After all, having someone with whom to discuss the clues makes mysteries better. I appreciate you watching. Additionally, keep in mind that while every home has a story, not all of them are ready to be shared.